Hi, everyone. Tom Belbacaro. Welcome to Politics in Perspective. So glad you can join us this week. I'm pleased we'll be having my guest, Alex Swoyer, in her book, Lawless, Lawfare, which puts the entire Trump-related lawfare into perspective. I think it's a must read if you want to truly understand the full amount of what's going on. Before that, we're going to talk a little bit about my good friend, Sarcasm Complete, Gavin Newsom, and his latest travails, and also the fact that the Republicans were finally able to actually cut some spending. But before we do that, this is, of course, on Patriot.tv's channel. You can get that at their Rumble channel, my Rumble channel, YouTube, and Political Vanguard. .com. Let's talk a little bit about the Republicans and the rescission bill. So we have a $6 trillion federal budget, and the last 2 weeks we've had nothing but consternation because Republicans wanted to cut $9 billion. That is 0.01% of the federal budget. Think about that. What you really need to do is think about it in the context of Argentina, which cut their spending 30%. They had outrageous inflation, triple digit. They've gotten that incredibly under control in a very short period of time. And they did that by cutting back government size of the economy. Yet here we are in America, $6 trillion, and the Democrats saying things like, well, Representative Dingell, when talking to the communists running for New York City mayor this week, said that she understands that there's issues related to Jews in him, but she's also concerned about children dying. Of course, you had Chuck Schumer say that people are going to die because we put in a work requirement for able-bodied people. That's all the Democrats got. Is everybody's dying unless government goes from 35% of the economy to 45 to 55, whatever. Pick a country in Europe, and you'll get close to 70% when you throw in regulations as well. But you also get a stagnant economy and a stagnant standard of living. On the other hand, everybody comes to the United States. But the rescission package is the first cut in government in decades in that form. So it's $9 billion. Yes, we got rid of NPR. Nobody in Oklahoma, Alabama, New York, Alaska, pick a state, should be taxed for NPR. Let George Soros fund it. I'm sure he is. He's buying up radio stations around the country. Let him fund that and put out their propaganda. But they're in this day and age where the internet exists, there is no reason for the government to be funding public broadcasting. Now, look, if public broadcasting was, here's an emergency, or ads that public service announcements, that would be one thing. But that's not what NPR or PBS are anymore. So let them get donations from their rich liberal following. They will. I assure you they will. It's not the end of the world. The important thing is, oh my God, we cut 0.01%. But you know what? That's not going to save Social Security and Medicare. They're both hundreds of billions underwater now. It'll be much worse in the next decade. So I want you to look at the date you're watching this, write it down, and say, where will Americans be 10 years from now? And you're going to see Social Security and Medicare in deep trouble, interest on the debt at maybe $2 trillion. And if we don't get our act together, Social Security and Medicare and many other things are going to be in worse than deep trouble. Now let's turn to Gavin Newsom, who's running for president. He will declare after the midterms in December, if not before. He said this week, this is the fraud that is Gavin Newsom, by the way. He said this week that California set a record for green energy production. And that is a perfect example of Gavin Newsom. That's all he is. He puts out a headline to make you feel good that he's saving the earth. But as far back as 2016, California's energy was 80% higher than the national average. Think about that number. Who does that matter to? Businesses. That's why they leave, because energy is inconsistent and too expensive. Families. The poor can't afford to leave, but the middle class has left for other places. So what really matters when you come to picking a president? Someone who gets headlines for himself, or someone who raises the cost on individuals and ignores their true plight? California is 50th in the nation in affordability, 50th in the nation in opportunity, the last in America as a place to start up a business. I could go on. But never forget the fraud that is Gavin Newsom. He doesn't fix things, he sues people. So let's go to real quick, just one little headline here I want to show you, because they have Trump finally cut off high-speed rail. Now, high-speed rail was put on the ballot 15, 16, 17, forever ago. And we were told it was going to be $33 billion, and there would be this amazing train going at light speed from LA to San Francisco. First thing that happened is that they wouldn't even be able to get to San Francisco. They really wouldn't get to downtown LA. And they've been nothing but cost overruns. Now they say it's 130 billion. I'm sure if they kept going with this thing, it'll go even higher. They have tracks in the middle of the Central Valley where nobody wants it. And the federal government has said enough's enough. Now, federal government is pretty simple. If you're seeking funding, you're supposed to give them a plan. You're supposed to stick with your plan. But if you're, I don't know, 400% over budget, and you're not getting anywhere, and you have no proof of how you're going to do the rest of this, that too is Gavin Newsom. He's an appropriator. He's not a business person of any value. He should not run anything. And so remember this day as well, because in December of 2026, when he announces for president, he's going to tout his accomplishments. But those will all be fiction. What matters is how real people's lives are affected here in California, and it's been a disaster. That's my opening argument. Now let's go. When we come back, we'll have the discussion with Alex Swoyer, whose book, Lawless, Lawfare, should be on your shelf and in your reading. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome back, everyone, to Politics in Perspective. I'm excited to have our next guest, Alex Swoyer, who's done incredible work with her latest book, Lawless, Lawfare, which is a definite must. Alex, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. The lawfare topic, it's like the tree that keeps on giving.
Yeah, whether we want it or not, right? Often not. So I got to tell you, what I like, I'm an attorney, too long, for 38 years, which is 37 too long. But the reason why I wanted to have you on is perspective. The show's called Politics in Perspective. And you might not know this story, but I wrote a very popular op-ed for 24 hours way back in the day in 2016, describing the FBI investigations into Hillary and Trump in an exhaustive timeline. And at the time, people were saying that, oh, you're taking the Hillary things out of context. So I put it all into context. I was fired from Forbes for doing that, by the way. Somebody got to them and got me thrown off. So why am I telling you this story? Because what I like about your book is that it's all there. And the Democrats might say, "Oh, this case is really good," or that. But unless you see the forest, your book's the forest. People can now see it. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate what you've done. So please tell us your inspiration for wanting to do the book.
Well, thank you. No, thank you so much for having me. And I'll talk a little bit about the book, but yeah, like when I was thinking about this, I think you kind of hit on it. Like Overkill was another title. I was like, oh, because it was like the sheer number of cases against President Trump. I mean, the four criminal indictments came down in the span of 4 months. I don't know if people, we heard about them for so much, they were all in the news, but like when you actually look at the timeline, it's pretty wild. And I hate to use the word unprecedented, but that's what it was. It all was very unprecedented. And so I'm a lawyer, like you mentioned. I have a group of law school friends that I talk to, and it just seems like every time some of these cases were coming down, we have like, our little group chat, we would talk about them. And not everyone was necessarily like a super big Trump supporter, but everyone was the type that would say like, yeah, like these cases, they don't really hold water, or like this seems a bit far. And I thought that, readers needed to know, lay people who don't know the law need to have this type of book lay out exactly what happened. And it really was the weaponization of our court system for politics. Politics took over our courts. And some of the things I did for this book, I talked to Laura Trump a bit. She talked about how the lawfare had damaged the family. Almost all of them, she was very kind of raw about it, like didn't really want to go too much in the detail. She said, even like getting a mortgage was difficult, which you think for the Trump family, that would not be the case, right? Both she and Don Jr. also told me that they really believed that had, Trump not won, that he would be behind bars. Like ultimately, they did not see the Democrats in their lawfare stopping until he was locked up. That was the end goal. And I also remember talking to her, Laura Trump, which I highlight in the book, and it's kind of timely with this being, July and the anniversary of the Butler, Pennsylvania assassination attempt. But she kind of walks me through when Trump was going to get his mugshot taken, the infamous mugshot, and how he called her to get her take on, how it would play. And she predicted it would be, quote, Elvis Presley level. And boy, was she right. And so I think you have that image, and you have, of course, the image from Butler, Pennsylvania, really, of him coming up after he was, the bullet, um, with his fist in the air. And like, those are really the two images that you think of from the 2024 election. And so she's talked a little bit about that. I have 16 chapters where I break down, the various cases. I don't just talk about Trump. I talk about those in his inner circle who also were caught up in legal issues, even his supporters. What I found was actually a couple out in Texas were interesting. They had counter protested the Biden bus, like the Biden campaign bus. And they ended up having like big law and Democrats come after them using the Ku Klux Klan Act, saying that they violated the right to vote. They ultimately had to go to trial. They had First Amendment defenses and they won. But as a lawyer, like at the cost of how many hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, right? So, this book kind of spans not just all the Trump lawsuits, and even like the one that was all the moves to try to kick him off the ballot. People are like, oh yeah, the Colorado case at the Supreme Court. I'm like, yeah, there's that one too. It's just like, it was just all of them. Everyone thinks of the criminal ones, but there was also the civil fraud in New York and the E. Jean Carroll defamation case. It was just a barrage. And I looked also at some of the media research and the coverage of it all, which, you and I can probably talk about the legal issues with some of these cases and the conflicts and dive into them that way. But the media also really butchered the coverage of it all.
So you mentioned, I want to get into some of the details of your book. And I was going to highlight what Laura said about how it affected the family. But real quick, so you mentioned the four cases. It's easy for some people to forget that three of them still exist at some level. Could you give us a quick rundown of what the status of
Yeah.
this?
So the four criminal cases, right? Two were federal, and those had to be dismissed because of Trump winning the election. Now, they were dismissed without prejudice. So, hypothetically, I guess there's some of those charges that have longer statute of limitations. Should a Democrat win the White House and the Justice Department, they really want to be aggressive. Like, I guess possibly they could try to resurrect some of these. I don't know. We'll see. But the two state criminal cases was the hush money trial, for which he had a conviction in New York out of Manhattan. And then the Fulton County, Georgia, RICO racketeering conspiracy charge that was related to the 2020 election that Fani Willis was pushing. So both of those are still going on. And what's happening with the hush money trial currently, the conviction, that appeal, is President Trump's attorneys are trying to move that to federal court. Essentially, that would give him a way to then get to the Supreme Court and maybe have this conviction wiped. That's where that stands. Now, the Georgia case is pretty interesting because it has been ruled that Fani Willis, as I kind of detail in the book, had some conflicts of interest, to say the least. She had hired her boyfriend to be the special counsel prosecuting the RICO case. She was paying him very, very well out of county funds, which this all came to be. And I think it was in one of the motions I saw that he had never actually even practiced a RICO or brought a RICO case. So, like the county likely would never have given a blessing for him to be the one that's paid to do such a case. And so she ended up being removed for the handling of the funds and paying her boyfriend, and then the two of them going on these lavish vacations together. So what would happen in the state of Georgia is the governor cannot pardon Trump or his co-defendants. It has to go to a pardon board, and all that usually happens after a conviction. So they have, I guess, this nonpartisan group of basically county DAs, and someone could choose to take over this case. No one has. I talked to John Eastman in the book, and he is one of the defendants, and he said that, I guess, at the time that they believed that the Cobb County District Attorney would take it over, potentially. But it looks like, as far as I've been able to keep up with, Fani Willis is in a process of appealing to the state Supreme Court her removal from the case. And then also she's appealed to the state Supreme Court because the Republicans in Georgia are investigating this and her handling of everything. And they've tried to subpoena her, and she's fighting that. So there seems to be, the Georgia Supreme Court is the one kind of fielding what's going on right now with Georgia. The last case
Right.
you hinted to, you said 3. So I'll go real quick. The New York civil fraud case. That's with the New York Attorney General, Letitia James. So that one is very interesting. I actually think it might have been the New York Post. If you don't mind me, I'm going to look down real quick and see what the number of days are. So it says typically, like, when that's appealed, I think they have a judgment in a matter of like 30 days or something, but that it's been 293 since they heard Trump's appeal for the civil fraud case. So I don't know, what is it? Is it politics that's keeping those judges from issuing some sort of ruling on his appeal of that civil fraud verdict that's like, 450 plus million? Now that it has all the interest, it's probably way over that. But that's where everything kind of stands. It's still happening.
Yeah, and I think your point about depending on who wins the White House next, but we'll get to that later, because the ultimate question I want to ask you is lawfare here to stay? But before we get there, so you went through all of these, and I haven't read your whole book, but I read a good deal of it. Thank you for my copy. But what struck you the most? What you talked about how the four of these in a 4-month period, but you went through many more cases. So what
I did.
impacted you? What impacted you the most about seeing
So
all of this?
2 things. I'll go 2 ways there. I think first and foremost, as a lawyer and someone who cares about the First Amendment, was the treatment of our free speech rights. And so with those criminal cases, each one put a gag order on President Trump. And I'm sure you agree with me as a lawyer, but most people, I think, with common sense would agree, you don't have to be a lawyer, that if anyone in America deserves to have the right to speak freely, it would be a defendant that's, looking to potentially go behind bars, lose their liberty. They should be able to freely defend themselves. Okay. And that was not afforded to President Trump. And during that time, I just looked at really the criminal cases. I'm sure there was other civil cases and potential gag issues there. But with the criminal aspect, he did about 90 campaign rallies while under these criminal gag orders. And if you think about that, if you care about the First Amendment, it's very troubling. If you care about political speech, the idea that we, applaud debate and disagreement in our country, that, elections should be won at the ballot box, not in courtrooms, then you are very troubled when you hear that statistic, that number. The other thing that I think troubled me, and maybe this kind of goes hand in hand, is that no media really petitioned to challenge these gag orders. There was one podcaster out of New York who tried to challenge the gag order out of the Judge Merchan's trial, the Manhattan hush money trial. And, a lot of times you want press to push for more and more access, but they just didn't have that interest here for that to be, they're able to hear from the witnesses, but they weren't able to hear from the actual defendant fully. And that's unfortunate. I guess not surprising when you look at some of the Media Research Center's data. They were great about tracking some of this, and I really leaned on them a lot in this book, and I credit them for a lot of their reporting. One in particular, we talked about Fonnie Willis. I got to point this one out. So I think it was like ABC and CBS did about like 90 stories or so on her trial against her case against Trump in April of 2024. And out of all of those, none mentioned that she was a Democrat. So you have a Democrat district attorney charging the Republican presidential candidate, and they don't mention her party affiliation. What's even more troubling is that she was running for re-election at the time. So it's like, how could you not put that in there? It's total journalistic malpractice. And that seemed to be kind of a, habit that we saw.
Yeah, if you look at the first 10 amendments, all of them related to the experience we had related to how the King of England would pick out people he wanted jailed
Yeah,
and systematically took away their rights. So you're right, saying a defendant can't talk would have been straight out of of why
right.
we had a revolution, right?
Absolutely. Not just that fact, but looking at it was like I start with Russia, because I argue that really the lawfare kind of began with that, the special counsel. Then we graduated to impeachments, and then from impeachments to indictments. And it was just like an ongoing, decades long, really slippery slope that the Democrats had led us down. And it kept making me think of like, who's a dictator that jails their opponents? And like, I think of Venezuela. I think of like, all third world countries that don't have fair elections like we do. And it just seems like that's the direction we were going. Like even with the Russia stuff, like they really tried to pick off one by one people in Trump's inner circle. General Michael Flynn talked to me for this book about his experience. Steve Bannon. It was just anything they could do really to try to get to Trump, but also Steve Bannon pointed out to basically halt their agenda, which he said the Russia investigation did. He's like, if you really look at it, they did a pretty good job at keeping at the time that America First agenda for us to come in and dismantle things. It really didn't happen. And, that was, I think, part of the motive, really, at first. And then it became even more. It was like to silence any opposition and even to jail them,
Yeah, okay,
to
so
bankrupt them too, right? We've talked about some of those judgments.
yeah, so yeah, let's stick with motive for a minute. And why they, as you went through all of this, talking about why they did it. Um, and by the way, I think I've talked on my show about this. Pericles during Greek democracy, they didn't go after him directly with lawfare, but they went after his close associates. It's the same sort of thing. So my question is, what do Democrats think they accomplished? Do they think that this worked? Because you talked about Lara. I have some notes here. Flynn in the book, he said, "quote Your book said I had to really scratch out a living." End quote. I
Hmm.
mean, enormous personal.
Right.
Um, you talked
He said it
about
it impacted his son. His son got divorced
yeah,
from it. Like, I mean, the first chapter, so my first chapter originally when I was writing was going to be Russia, but I ended up, as authors do when they're writing, they kind of move things around. So like at the end I was going to wrap it all up with like how the stuff you were just talking about, like the cost to people. So not only the financial cost of all of the lawfare, but the emotional cost. And that just stuck out to me so much. I moved it to the first chapter. I was like, this has to be out there
yeah, and
because
I
it's just,
I have friends who names will go unmentioned who I actually consulted with. They wound up entrapped with this. They had to give
yep,
testimony. They had enormous legal bills. And what I was thinking at the time, and I'm sure you did too, the very point of this exercise wasn't just to slow down the agenda that you made, but to stop good people from going into Republican politics, because
100%.
this would
And
be,
to your point, stop Republican lawyers from representing them. Because,
yes,
yeah, I touch on that in the book. You had so many of the Republican lawyers who were, involved with either defending some of these people or helping Trump mainly, um, had all these ethics complaints filed against them. And their bars, the state bars are extremely liberal and we're tolerating these complaints. And I mean, like Ken Paxton's and Sidney Powell, neither of them ended up losing their license. John Eastman told me he has like a ridiculous amount of lawsuits he's battling, and like what he's had to go through with the California bar. The fact that he says he knows, some of the Democrats that have had, lawmakers, let's say in DC, Senator Schiff, Eric Swalwell, he says that they've had complaints against them and he has no knowledge that they've had to answer to them. So he's just, it just seems uneven handed, trying to like what people saw, the American public saw with the handling of the cases against Trump. And to your point, I don't think Democrats expected it to. I don't know how you don't do that many lawsuits and not think it's going to backfire, but I don't think they thought it would backfire, and it totally did. So it was. I talked to a pollster in the book, and he kind of just told me like, when the Fulton County, Georgia case, everybody heard racketeering and RICO, and they're like, what? That kind of doesn't sound like politics. And then the hush money one, he said, everybody was just like, don't all celebrities pay hush money? Like, who cares? It just didn't stick, And like you and I know that wasn't necessarily like the exact legal issue that he was being charged with, but that's how people heard about it and that's what they thought. And so voters just really, it just seemed like too much and it turned them off. And I think it ultimately helped motivate people to go to the polls to vote for Trump.
so do you think that's the way Democrats look at it? Because they've had successes. Your own state, Rick Perry, when he went to run for president and was indicted, right? That sidetracked him and affected his career. We know the effect it had on Governor McDonald of Virginia,
Right.
um, and a lot of Democrats got away with it. Lisa Page,
Governor
who
Rod Blagojevich, he's in the book. He talked to me a little bit about his experience. So yeah, like no, I think you're right, and I think even Ken Paxton, Texas Attorney General, talked to me a lot about what he experienced. He's in a Senate race. I'm not sure what the numbers look like now, what's going on. So that's yet to be determined if it damaged him or not. But yeah, I think that remember when the Iran strikes happened not too long ago? All of a sudden, the Democrats started talking about impeachment and war powers. That quickly cooled down. And so maybe they realized that, at least when it comes to Trump, going after him in terms of impeachment or in the courts, it didn't play well. I don't know if that necessarily means they're going to tamp down their lawfare because, it seems like since he's taken office, that strategy has changed. It's more like they've really targeted his agenda, right? Like, I mean, I think uh, Article 3 Foundation has at least 260 plus lawsuits that the administration is facing, targeting, either immigration, firings, hirings, Doge cuts, all that. So, I think that they've just kind of shifted their strategy, but they're still leaning on the courts.
Interesting. There was a poll the other day. I thought about this interview when the poll came out. You mentioned Russia. Rasmussen polls said a majority of Democrats still think that was a real thing, that Trump.
Yeah.
Uh, how much, when you were looking at your book, I mean, I talked to, California. There's a lot of Democrats, it turns out there, and they still believe these things. So, how much of it, depending on who you listen to, how much of this, with the deep state, which is very deep, right? It's right there on the surface. How much of this is just a sustained PR effort, and won't they do this to the very next Republican, whoever it is?
They could. I mean, if they feel their messaging worked initially, they could try that playbook again. Um, going a little bit off the lawfare topic, I think you look at a party that is really just in disarray. They don't necessarily have a leader. When you have the New York City mayor race becoming such a focal point for them, and Mandani becoming the one that's getting all of the media attention, coming to DC for breakfast with AOC, as his message is to have government run grocery stores and even take away private property. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure. Their messaging is lost. And so would they go back to the same well, the Russia well, or try to reuse some of the same tactics? Maybe. It's very possible.
Okay, so
They seem lost.
yes,
They're
but as you
lost
point out,
that they lost, and now they don't know what to do.
but they aren't good at filing lawsuits. A lot of people ask me, so I'll ask you about the pardons and where this goes
Yeah.
from here. And I tell them, this is a different sort of thing, because in order to get this before a court, whether the pardon was valid, no judge just suddenly says it's invalid. There has to be someone would have to put. Maybe I'm wrong. You tell them. Someone would have to put this forward as a defense, because they get indicted for something they believe is covered by the pardon,
Right.
and then
That's my
then with
understanding.
yeah. So does this is Fauci going to be the one, or where do you see this going
So I mean,
forward?
like, that's a good point. Is so all these like talks about the pardons that were issued by President Biden. Just Adam Schiff is looking at potential mortgage issues, right? So he received a pardon as part of the January 6th committee from President Biden. And if you go read the pardon text, it talks about, having been a member of the January 6th committee, like having investigated the committee in all matters related to. So, should he be charged? Maybe his lawyer might try to argue, hey, he has this pardon and he's being charged because he served on the January 6th committee, because President Trump and his administration don't like that he investigated January 6th. I mean, it's a stretch, but they might try to use it as a defense.
And isn't that then the only way we're going to find out whether any of these pardons can be undone? Because we're in completely unknown territory, right?
Yeah,
This is
it's really
never.
interesting. Like I've been asked about this auto pin thing for a while. So my understanding is the DOJ had issued a memorandum back during like the Bush years that yes, it's fine to use the auto pin, but it was just never used to the extent that Biden used it, right? And some of the stuff that's come out, obviously, it's not really like the use of the auto pen, it's the mental health surrounding the use of the auto pen. And so if this is being used, is there documents? Is there recordings? Do we know when a staffer goes to a president and an assistant and has them sign off at a certain time on whatever it is that they're going to be using an auto pen on? Is there any sort of records? That's some of the questions that I would have, that you would think an investigation would, uncover. Maybe a special counsel. Right now, I think the latest I heard is that the White House counsel is looking into it. So, I don't know if the Biden White House kept anything like that. I'm not sure. It seems like they're not willing to talk either. Everyone keeps pleading the fifth.
Or she couldn't remember. Who was the person who said she couldn't remember if she ever woke up the president? I'm pretty sure that in my life,
If I
I'm
had to
busy.
wake up the president of the United States, I think I would remember.
Yeah,
Yeah,
first of all, I'd want to know why the hell I was in the area where he was sleeping, let alone
right.
me waking him up. Um, I can't get away without asking lawyers about. And I was on with John. We had John Solomon last week, so it's a good follow up. Epstein seems to be everywhere. I did a Facebook post last night. We're friends on Facebook about that. No, my prediction is there will never be satisfaction on this issue. That it was
Yeah,
oversold. Go ahead.
I don't know. I think that so, you and I are talking on the heels of the Wall Street Journal story just coming out and Trump saying he's going to sue the Wall Street Journal because this is a fake letter. Um, for me, I kind of think that the Wall Street Journal kind of gave Trump an out here. They gave him and Pam Bondi a redo for how they've handled the investigation so far and their decision not to, release anything. Now it looks like they have at least a path to maybe make some of his supporters happy because they can address it again and maybe have a better, I guess, more succinct messaging between the two of them and even possibly out of the FBI. One of the things I always think is interesting is uh, what about videos? She talks about like there's terrible videos and stuff. Well, I mean, if the FBI has videos, why aren't they the ones looking at it and identifying the people? I don't know. It's just, there's a lot of questions surrounding it. I understand why people want it asked and answered. And it's just, you also understand you don't want to release names unless you have actual video evidence of them committing a crime, right? Because if you just have a list and you don't know what they actually did, you can't do that to people. So it's definitely an interesting situation they found themselves in. But I think the Wall Street Journal story kind of gives the Trump administration a second chance to address this. Oh, it's kind of become a quote unquote scandal.
Okay, so back to your book. At the end of it, and we just have a couple minutes remaining. At the end of writing it, do you have a sense that there is a way to curtail this, or is this a plague on our legal and our political system for
Yeah.
the foreseeable future?
So I explore that idea, like, what do you do to stop this? Steve Bannon was like, "Oh, we should do public hearings. Like, these people should be called to answer things out in the public." Governor Rod Blagojevich said, like, "Let's do a presidential commission and have it be bipartisan, trying to figure out what to do." House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan told me he had legislation to try to let politicians like this, if they have a state charge, to be able to transfer it to federal court, because that seems to be where a lot of them get into situations and venues that are extremely hostile to, like deep blue counties, deep blue states, or deep red, versus if that was to be, if the vice, if the, if the reverse was to happen with Republicans. So, do we know what's going to happen? No. Is lawfare here to stay? I kind of worry that the courts and politics is here to stay, especially with how we keep seeing some of these judges acting towards the Trump administration policies and this idea that the rule of law is under threat, the type of rhetoric we're hearing. I don't know how you take the politics out of it. I think we might have gone too far. One of the things as a legal affairs reporter that I don't like is that when I have such a highly political case and I look at who the judge is, I can like see who appointed them and kind of know what they're going to do. And it shouldn't be like that. You shouldn't be able to look at the judge and know, oh, you were appointed by a Republican or you were appointed by a Democrat, so this is how the outcome was going to be. And that's too
Okay,
troubling.
one last question before you go, because you're an attorney. The nationwide injunction issue we saw, the Supreme Court said you shouldn't be doing that. The other thing that bothers me about the way the Democrats are doing lawfare is part of me says immediately that there's no way that a district court judge should issue an injunction against the government ex parte. The government should be there and know what the discussion is. Some of these judges don't ever hear from the government and put this in place.
Yeah.
And eh, look, I don't wake up trusting government. Thomas Paine said we shouldn't. George Washington said we shouldn't. Right? That's not. But this process of a partisan judge, partisan, on and on and on. So um, comment on that real quick, and then tell everybody where they can get your podcast and your book.
So one of the things in that opinion that I thought initially, and I think some of us thought might slow those nationwide, or what some people call universal injunctions, down, is the aspect of having to have a class action to be able to get one. Usually forming a class action takes time. It's not as quick of a process as we've recently seen some of these judges wanting to turn some of these cases into just, yes, class certification. They sign off on it. So I think what the next round of litigation might be, and what might actually get up to the Supreme Court again, is whether or not this is a class, and maybe that sets some parameters there. In terms of my book, people who have questions or want to check it out, they can go to Amazon. There's some stuff you can order it on Amazon. You can order it on Barnes and Noble website. Also, Target has it. I really appreciate the support, and they can follow my reporting at the Washington Times.
All right, great. Alex, thanks so much for coming on.
No,
Great work
thank you
with.
so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you putting things into context with this book. And if you're listening to this and you want to see the whole picture, well, she's done a hell of a lot of work for you and made it quite easy. This is the Cliff Notes to Lawfare, but it's chock full. Excellent work. Thank you, and we'll be right back with Politics in Perspective. Welcome back to Politics in Perspective. I hope you enjoyed that presentation and discussion with Alex. I hope you get her book. It's really all in one place. And if you want to be able to discuss this with others and give that full context, this is definitely the book to get. In the weeks ahead, we're going to have some additional guests talking not just about this particular subject, but the fate of the two parties. And what I mean by that is, where are these two parties going? Because there's no doubt the Democrats are trying to find their footing. I'm going to talk to a prominent journalist, Carla Marinucci, from the formerly of the Chronicle and Politico, about where the Democrats are today. Rod Martin's going to join me and talk about the fate of the Republicans going forward. But that's our show for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in, and thanks to AUN TV and Patriot.tv. You can find this show on Patriot.tv's Rumble channel, my own Rumble channel, and YouTube, and the links are always at politicalvanguard.com. Thanks so much for tuning in.